and I would like to welcome first to our stage Ms. Renee Jones from down the street at Boston College School of Law. She comes to us with a lot of experience in both the academic angle of what is corporate governance, what does this all mean? She can give us, we are at a university today, we do want to have this academic underpinning to our conversation, so she's going to provide that to us. She also comes with a lot of, industry experience, having served as the former director of the Division of Corporate Finance at the US SEC. So please welcome Renee.
So thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here. And as was mentioned, I'm going to be providing an academic perspective on the topic of corporate governance, but I won't be able to help but add in or include my perspective as a lawyer, former practicing lawyer, and also, as mentioned, as the former director of the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance. So I'm just going to be providing a high-level overview of the topic of corporate governance, and I'm going to focus on what are the sources of corporate governance standards, some recent and looming changes to corporate governance rules, and some preliminary thoughts on how corporate leaders should respond to this rapidly changing regulatory landscape. So first, what is corporate governance? So one way of thinking about corporate governance is that it's just a system for allocating or dividing decision-making authority among the primary corporate actors, which are shareholders, corporate officers, and corporate directors. Of course, the decisions and priorities of these primary actors also influence the wealth and well-being of a much broader group, including employees, creditors, customers, local communities, and broader society. So an effective corporate governance system has to find a way to take the interests of these other actors into account as well. An effective corporate governance system has to include these two key elements. The first is information. We have to have reliable information systems for financial reporting and also for disclosure. And we need good systems for accountability provided by corporate fiduciary duties, investor rights, and anti-fraud protections. So if we don't have access to reliable information about a company's operations and its financial performance, decision makers within the corporation won't be able to make sound decisions about the corporation's operations and how to manage the business. And investors, if they don't have access to reliable information, they won't be able to make sound decisions when making investment decisions, buying and selling securities, or as shareholders are voting their shares. And then if we don't have effective accountability mechanisms, then corporate officials might be tempted to shirk their responsibilities, to engage in self-dealing, or even commit fraud. So where does corporate governance come from? I think of corporate governance as really coming from an amalgam of state corporate law, federal securities law, and best practice standards that are promulgated by a range of private organizations, the stock exchanges, NACD, Business Roundtable, just for some examples. So first of all corporations are creatures of state law. They're created under state law, and state law imposes fiduciary duties on corporate officers and directors, and these fiduciary duties can be enforced by shareholders in class action or derivative litigation. And then corporate law also gives shareholders voting rights. They have the right to elect directors, and they also have the right to vote on certain fundamental corporate transactions, mergers, acquisitions, changes to the charter, or dissolution. And then on top of, sort of layered on top of these corporate law rules are federal securities laws. So the SEC, of course, provides disclosure rules, and that again helps ensure that investors are informed when they're buying or selling securities and when they're voting their shares. And then the SEC has proxy rules which govern the conduct of shareholder meetings, and that really ensures that there are mechanisms, effective mechanisms for shareholders to express their voice on important corporate matters and also stakeholder concerns. So that's sort of the system of corporate governance. Now I just want to take a few minutes to talk about some changes to corporate governance rules that have recently occurred or that are looming on the horizon. So first at the state level. In an attempt, possibly futile attempt, to stem an incipient tide of reincorporations from Delaware to other states, Delaware's legislature has begun to loosen its oversight over controlling shareholder transactions, and also has made it much more difficult for shareholders to initiate lawsuits to enforce fiduciary duties. And then at the SEC, under the leadership of current chair Paul Atkins, the SEC has indicated that it intends to dilute longstanding mandatory disclosure rules and also to sharply curtail shareholders' voting rights, including shareholders' rights to submit proposals for a vote at the shareholder meeting. Now, these proposed reforms are likely to expand the existing gulf between investors, stakeholders, and corporate leaders, and they may lead eventually to more disruptive efforts by stakeholders to express their voice. So some corporate managers, possibly many corporate managers and their advocates, generally have been supporting these recent and proposed regulatory reforms. And that sort of makes sense because, at least in the short term, they're going to eliminate some short-term pain that comes from dealing with shareholder proposals, dealing with shareholder litigation, and also dealing with the impact of adverse shareholder votes. But I do think that this deregulatory project that seems to be underway really forebodes significant harms both to corporations and to their investors. I think these reforms are going to fray the already strained lines of communication between corporate leaders and investors. That increases the risk of employee and consumer dissatisfaction, and that can lead to attrition, it can lead to consumer boycotts, and other forms of business disruption. So just two examples. Most recently, Disney's temporary benching of Jimmy Kimmel in response to some comments he made after the Charlie Kirk murder. So Kimmel was taken off the air because the FCC chairman basically threatened Disney, and they acted very precipitously without a lot of forethought or analysis. That triggered a massive consumer boycott. Disney lost 1.7 million subscribers in just a few days. The Writers Guild and high-profile talent voiced their objections, and some of Disney's stars threatened to withdraw from Disney projects. So Disney reversed course, as we all know, very quickly, but only after suffering considerable financial and also reputational harm. Another example is Target. So Target walked back its commitment to DEI initiatives in January 2025, very soon after Donald Trump reassumed the presidency. And Target's move was also greeted by a massive consumer boycott, which Target has yet to recover from. They had announced their DEI initiatives in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, and actually these DEI initiatives had contributed significantly to Target's growth. So the boycotts that were initiated soon after have resulted in serious harm to Target's bottom line, decreased foot traffic, decreased sales, and the stock price has also fallen dramatically. And the CEO who made this decision actually has stepped down. In this contrast, the experience at Target contrasts with the experience at Costco, which reinforced its commitment to DEI initiatives, and its sales have actually increased while Target's have fallen. So how should corporate leaders respond to this shifting, rapidly shifting, and really unpredictable corporate landscape? So possibly, you can take advantage of the freedom and the flexibility and the lack of regulatory scrutiny, scaling back disclosure, maybe moving from quarterly to semi-annual reporting, if that's what the law ends up allowing. Corporations and their leaders can decide to stay silent on hot-button issues, try to fly under the radar and avoid inflaming either side in these flaring culture wars. And they can pull back from commitments that they've made that are important to stakeholders and their investors. So these are all options that are on the table, but I think that pursuing that approach would be very short-sighted and in the short, medium, and long-term harmful to corporations and their interests and their investors. Why would it be a mistake to sort of take advantage of all this freedom? It's like, hey, parents are away for the weekend, let's have a wild party. Well, first of all, I think that the regulatory pullback may be short-lived. So we don't know what's going to happen in 2 years or 1 year. Maybe it's just 1 year now at the midterms, and we don't know what's going to happen with the next presidential election. And if leadership changes, if financial or economic conditions change, these current changes and the the foretold or forecasted changes, they may not occur, they might be rolled back. In addition, corporations aren't just governed by state corporate law and federal securities law, they're also governed by other substantive laws, they're governed by state securities laws, and they're governed by foreign laws, and many have pledged to comply with voluntary standards. So all of those rules are still out there, and you have to balance all of those rules when you're considering your conduct, even though the state corporate law and federal securities law tends to loom largest in the boardroom. I'm concerned also that relaxing oversight processes, relaxing corporate governance standards, how boards make decisions and the rigor of their oversight is going to heighten operational and legal risks. And that could expose companies to tort liability, more shareholder litigation to the extent that shareholders still have the right to sue. It's going to be more difficult, but they're not going to stop. Lawyers are creative. They're going to keep bringing lawsuits. And I'm also concerned about corporate underperformance. If we have weaker internal controls, there's less oversight of things like possible fraud, maybe happening at lower levels of a corporation, embezzlement, things like that. If we loosen restrictions, all kinds of things can go wrong within the corporation. Just one example would be the failures of SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, and First Republic Bank after Congress rolled back Dodd-Frank oversight of banking rules and banking practices. So to kind of wrap up, I would just say that corporate governance best practices, those that are enshrined in law and those that are adopted in response to investor demands, do help promote effective and efficient management of our largest corporations. So I think despite the regulatory rollback, that leaders are well advised to adhere to best practices that have a long record of success. I think active engagement with shareholders and stakeholders is really essential to ensure that corporate leaders remain in touch with investor and public sentiment. Robust financial reporting and prompt disclosure of material information is going to reduce cost of capital, and it also insulates companies and their leaders from liability for fraud. And I fear that restricting shareholder access to proxy statements is going to drive more disruptive forms of communication with management, and that increasing barriers to shareholder litigation will only serve to facilitate fraud and will contribute to boom and bust cycles in our economy as a result of misallocation of resources that frequently occur in opaque markets or markets that are distorted by fraud. So those are some preliminary thoughts, but I'm really looking forward to the perspective of my fellow panelists on these issues. Thanks.